I woke up in a hospital bed with a tube down my throat and no wedding ring on my finger. The last thing I remembered was my mother's casserole, the one she made specially for me the night before my wedding. The familiar tingle on my lips, the terror of my throat closing, reaching for my EpiPen and finding it gone. My twin sister had moved it. The table looked cluttered, she said. For 35 years, I had been the daughter with severe allergies, the difficult one, the expensive one, the one who always caused problems. Madison was the easy twin, the favorite, the one they protected. I just never realized they were protecting her from me. When I finally opened my eyes, a nurse handed me my phone. I searched my own wedding hashtag and saw photos of a bride in my dress walking down the aisle on my father's arm. But the eyes behind the veil weren't mine. They were Madison's. And when my parents finally showed up at the hospital 2 days later, I asked them one question that made my mother's face turn white. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never saw the betrayal coming? My name is Haley Chapman. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial analyst at one of Boston's largest investment firms, and until recently, I believed that if I just worked hard enough and loved deeply enough, my family would eventually see my worth. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. To understand what happened the night before my wedding, you need to understand who I was in my family and, more importantly, who they needed me to be. I was born 7 minutes before my twin sister Madison, but those 7 minutes might as well have been a lifetime. I arrived in this world with a body that seemed designed to cause problems. Severe allergies to tree nuts, shellfish, and sesame seeds sent me to the emergency room 6 times before I turned 10. My parents never said they resented the medical bills, the midnight drives to the hospital, the constant vigilance required to keep me alive. They didn't have to say it. I could hear it in the sighs when I asked about ingredients at restaurants. I could see it in the way they looked at Madison, the easy daughter, the healthy daughter, the one who never caused trouble. So I learned to cause as little trouble as possible. I read ingredient labels before I could read chapter books. I carried emergency medication in my pocket before I could write my own name. I became a straight-A student, then a scholarship recipient, then a college graduate with honors, then a professional climbing the corporate ladder with quiet determination. Achievement became the only currency that bought me temporary approval in my own home. By 35, I was earning $125,000 a year. I owned my apartment. I had a retirement account, excellent credit, and the respect of my colleagues. What I didn't have was my family's acknowledgement that I had become their safety net. For 8 years, I had been quietly subsidizing their lives. My parents' health insurance premiums, $850 a month, came from my account after my father's employer dropped their coverage. Madison's rent during her 2-year finding herself phase cost me $1,400 monthly until she finally got steady work. I made the down payment on my parents' car. I covered their property taxes twice when they forgot to budget for them. I was their retirement plan, their emergency fund, their insurance policy against financial disaster, and they treated me like a burden they were graciously tolerating. I never complained. I told myself this was what family did. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, that my success was meaningless if I didn't share it, that someday they would see how much I had given. And finally look at me the way they looked at Madison. When Daniel proposed, I thought everything was changing. He came from the Mercer family, old money social connections, the kind of background my parents had always wanted access to. His mother, Eleanor, approved of my credentials, the Ivy League education, the 6-figure salary, the impeccable professional reputation. For once, I had done something that made my parents proud without reservation. What I didn't know was that 3 weeks before our wedding, my parents had borrowed $40,000 from Daniel's father to cover costs they couldn't afford. The debt would be forgiven once we were married. If the wedding didn't happen, they would owe money they had already spent and could never repay. My wedding had become their financial lifeline, and they would protect it at any cost, even if that cost was me. The night before my wedding, my childhood home looked more beautiful than I had ever seen it. Candles flickered on the dining table. My mother had set out the real china, the set she only used for Christmas and Easter. The house smelled like roasted mushrooms and fresh bread, and for one brief moment, I let myself believe that this dinner was exactly what my mother said it was, a celebration of my new beginning, a farewell to my life as a single woman. a gesture of love from the family I had spent 35 years trying to earn approval from. I should have known better. I should have recognized that the warmth was a performance, that the candles were set dressing, that the beautiful table was a stage. But I wanted so badly to believe that on this one night, the night before the most important day of my life, my family would finally show up for me the way I had always shown up for them. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a casserole dish, her face glowing with pride. She set it down in front of me like an offering. "I made your favorite," she said. "The mushroom and wild rice dish. Completely safe, sweetheart. I checked every single label." I remember feeling touched. My mother rarely cooked for me, specifically rarely went out of her way to accommodate my allergies. I thanked her. I meant it. I had no idea that hidden beneath the mushrooms ground fine into the pesto at the bottom of the dish were pine nuts. I had no idea that my mother knew exactly what she was serving me, that she was gambling with my life, telling herself that maybe the doctors had exaggerated, that maybe I would just get a little sick, just sick enough to miss the ceremony without ending up in the hospital. I had no idea that she had weighed my health against her $40,000 debt and decided that the debt mattered more. Madison was already at the table when I arrived, which surprised me. My sister was rarely early to anything. She was unusually attentive that night, refilling my water glass before I could ask, complimenting my engagement ring, telling me how excited she was to be my maid of honor. She played the devoted sister so convincingly that I almost forgot how distant she had been for the past 7 months, how she always seemed to have somewhere else to be whenever I wanted to spend time together. Daniel arrived 30 minutes late, apologizing about work calls that couldn't wait. He kissed my cheek when he came in, but he didn't meet my eyes. He sat down across from me and smiled, but the smile didn't reach the rest of his face. I told myself he was nervous about the wedding. I told myself that men process big emotions differently. I made excuses for him because that was what I had always done. My father sat at the head of the table, drinking steadily, saying almost nothing. He asked me once if I was excited about tomorrow, and when I said yes, he just nodded and looked away. I know now that he knew what was planned. He didn't have the courage to stop it, but he also couldn't bring himself to participate directly. His silence was his compromise. His silence was his cowardice. I took my first bite of the casserole and told my mother it was delicious. I took a second bite, then a third. We talked about the flowers for the ceremony, about the weather forecast, about how many guests had confirmed. Normal conversation, family conversation, the kind of evening I had always wanted and so rarely got. 15 minutes after I started eating, I felt the familiar tingle on my lips. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, just anxiety, just nerves about the wedding. But the tingle spread to my tongue, and then I felt it, the invisible hand closing around my throat, the slow tightening that I had experienced 5 times before in my life, the unmistakable signal that my body was turning against itself. "My EpiPen," I gasped, pushing back from the table. My purse was on the side table by the door, where I always kept it, where the EpiPen was always waiting in the inside pocket. "Oh, I moved your purse to the coat closet," Madison said. Her voice was calm, too calm. The table looked cluttered. I stumbled toward the closet, each breath harder than the last. My throat was swelling. I could feel my airway narrowing, the passage for oxygen shrinking with every second. I found my purse and dumped everything onto the floor. Wallet, keys, lipstick, phone, no EpiPen. "Madison!" I wheezed, my voice barely a whisper now. "Where is it?" "It should be there," she said. She hadn't moved from her chair. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, an expression I now know was anticipation disguised as concern. "It's always in your purse." I crawled toward the kitchen, thinking maybe there was one in a drawer. Maybe I had left a spare somewhere. Maybe someone would help me. My vision was starting to blur. Every breath sounded like wind through a cracked window. I could feel my heartbeat in my temples, too fast, too hard. My mother finally picked up her phone. But before she dialed 911, I heard her make another call. Just 3 words spoken quickly. "It's happening. Come." Then she called for the ambulance, describing my condition to the operator as a mild allergic reaction, as if I wasn't turning blue on her kitchen floor. My father stood frozen by the table. He watched his daughter suffocate and did nothing, because doing nothing was what he had always done, what he had perfected over a lifetime of letting my mother make every decision. Daniel sat on the couch with his head in his hands, whispering, oh God," over and over. He didn't run to me. He didn't try to help. He performed distress without taking a single action that might actually save me. Madison disappeared upstairs, saying she was going to look for a backup EpiPen. She was gone for 6 minutes. I know this because I was counting my breaths, each one a victory, each one possibly my last. When she came back down, her hands were empty, and the paramedics were pulling into the driveway. The EMTs worked fast: epinephrine injection, oxygen mask, IV line. The terrible pressure in my throat began to ease. I could breathe again, shallow breaths that hurt, but meant I was alive. "Who's coming with her?" the paramedic asked as they prepared to load me into the ambulance. Silence. "Family, fiancé. Someone needs to come." My mother stepped forward, then stopped. "I should stay here and notify the guests about tomorrow, in case something changes." "I'll follow in my car," Daniel said. He didn't move from the couch. They loaded me into the ambulance alone. Through the oxygen mask, through the doors that were starting to close, I watched my family standing in the driveway. They weren't crying. They weren't panicking. They were waiting like people who had reached the intermission of a play and were ready for the second act to begin. My mother was already turning back toward the house, her phone pressed to her ear, and Madison was walking up the stairs, toward the guest room, toward the closet where my wedding dress hung in its white garment bag, waiting for tomorrow. The ambulance doors closed, and I was alone with strangers who were trying to save my life while my own family stood in the driveway and watched me disappear. I didn't know yet what they were planning. I didn't know that in 14 hours my wedding would proceed exactly on schedule, with the same venue, the same guests, the same dress, the same vows. I didn't know that the woman walking down the aisle would have my face, but not my heart, my name, but not my consent. I didn't know that while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed, my twin sister would sign my name on a marriage certificate and steal the future I had spent my whole life building. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I couldn't breathe and nobody came with me, and something was very, very wrong. I woke up alone in a hospital room with a throat that felt like I had swallowed broken glass and arms covered in bruises from IV lines. The clock on the wall read 4:47 p.m. For a moment, I couldn't remember what day it was or why I was there. Then the memories came flooding back: the dinner, the casserole, the tightening in my throat, Madison's calm voice telling me she had moved my purse, the ambulance doors closing on my family standing in the driveway like spectators at a show. Saturday. It was Saturday afternoon. My wedding was scheduled for 2:00 p.m. on Saturday. I looked around the room, searching for some sign that someone had been there, that someone had sat by my bed and held my hand and waited for me to wake up. There were no flowers, no cards, no jacket draped over a chair, no half-empty coffee cup, no evidence that any of the people who were supposed to love me had spent even 5 minutes in this room. My phone was on the bedside table. A nurse must have found it in my belongings and left it there. I picked it up with shaking hands and opened Instagram, not because I wanted to check social media, but because I needed to know. I needed to see if they had canceled the wedding, if Daniel had come to the hospital instead of the church, if anyone had chosen me over the party. I searched for our wedding hashtag, the one I had created myself, excited and naive, and certain that I was about to start the happiest chapter of my life. 47 posts. I scrolled through photos of my venue, my flowers, my cake, my dress walking down the aisle on my father's arm. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. That was my dress. That was my father. That was my wedding happening exactly as planned while I lay unconscious 15 miles away. Then I zoomed in on a candid shot where the veil had shifted slightly, and everything I thought I knew about my family shattered into pieces. The chin was wrong. The posture was wrong. The small scar on my left eyebrow, the one I got when I fell off my bike at age 7, wasn't there. The woman in my wedding dress standing at my altar marrying my fiancé was not me. It was Madison. I kept scrolling with numb fingers. The ceremony, the kiss, Daniel lifting the veil and pressing his lips to my sister's mouth. The reception, Madison dancing with Daniel, her head thrown back in laughter, radiant in a way I had never seen her. The cutting of the cake, the bouquet toss, a full wedding documented in real time by guests who had no idea they were witnessing a crime. One comment caught my eye from a college friend I had lost touch with years ago. "Congrats, Haley. You look different somehow. Did you change your hair? Gorgeous either way." No one noticed. 100 guests watched my twin sister marry my fiancé in my dress, under my name, and no one noticed. Or maybe some of them noticed and said nothing because saying something would have been awkward, would have caused a scene, would have ruined the beautiful party. I pulled the IV out of my arm and got dressed in the clothes I had been wearing the night before, which someone had folded and placed in a plastic bag. A nurse tried to stop me, warned me about the risks of leaving against medical advice, asked me to at least wait for the doctor. I signed whatever forms they put in front of me and walked out. I took a cab to the apartment I shared with Daniel. The apartment that was still in my name that I had been paying for while he saved money for the wedding. My hands were steady as I unlocked the door. The shaking had stopped. Something cold and clear had replaced the panic, something that felt like the beginning of a decision I didn't know I was capable of making. His suitcase was by the door, half-packed. They were supposed to leave for the honeymoon. I had booked us flights to Cancun months ago, a trip I had been dreaming about, a week of sun and ocean and the beginning of our married life. But Madison's passport had expired. I remembered her mentioning that casually a few weeks ago, laughing about how disorganized she was. So they must be driving somewhere instead. Vermont, probably. The resort we had talked about visiting someday. Daniel's iPad was on the kitchen counter. He had left it behind, traveling light, or maybe just confident that I wouldn't wake up in time to find it. He knew his password was saved in my phone. He knew I had access to everything. He just didn't think I would look. He underestimated me. They all did. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the iPad. The main message threads showed nothing suspicious, just the normal conversations of a man planning a wedding with his fiancée. But I am a financial analyst. I audit expense reports for a living. I find the patterns that people try to hide the transactions. They think no one will notice. I know that deleted messages sync to iCloud, and iCloud backs up to connected devices, and nothing digital ever truly disappears. It took me 20 minutes to find the deleted thread between Daniel and Madison. 7 months of messages, pet names I had never heard him use, secret meetups at hotels and her apartment, and once horrifyingly in our bed while I was away at a conference. Complaints about me that I read with a strange detachment, like I was observing someone else's life. She's always so serious. She asks too many questions. She'll never just go along with anything. Photos I wished I could unsee, words I would never be able to forget. And then 3 weeks before the wedding, a conversation that made everything finally terribly clear. Madison had written, "What if she doesn't get sick enough to miss it?" Daniel replied, "She will. Your mom's using pine nuts. Ground up, she won't taste it. Doc said her allergies gotten worse over the years." Madison, "And if she figures it out," Daniel, "She won't. She's never figured anything out about us." I kept reading. Earlier messages 4 months ago about the prenup. Daniel had signed the clause that would cost him $30,000 if he canceled without cause. About my parents' debt to his father, the $40,000 they could never repay. About my mother suggesting the pine nuts, treating my life-threatening allergy like a convenient tool. They had poisoned me. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but actually poisoned me with premeditation and full knowledge of the consequences. They had discussed it over text messages like they were planning a dinner party. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with false relief. "Haley, oh, thank God the hospital said you were stable, but they wouldn't let us visit, something about family only, and they didn't believe." I saw the pictures. Silence. I read the messages. The silence stretched longer. I know about the pine nuts. I know about the $40,000. I know about Daniel and Madison. I know everything. When she spoke again, the mask was gone. "Haley, you have to understand. We were in an impossible situation. The debt, the prenup, Madison's happiness." "You poisoned me," I said. "You stole my wedding. You forged my signature on a legal document. And you were going to convince me it was my idea to walk away." "For the family," she said, as if those 3 words explained everything, excused everything. "You've always put family first. We knew you'd understand eventually." I laughed, and the sound surprised me. It was cold. It was final. "Don't call me again," I said, and hung up. After I hung up on my mother, I sat in the apartment for a long time, staring at Daniel's iPad, letting the full weight of what had happened settle into my bones. I could have screamed. I could have thrown things. I could have driven to wherever they were honeymooning and made a scene that would have given everyone a story to tell for years, but that was what they expected from me. That was the role they had written, the hysterical sister, The jilted bride, the woman who fell apart so completely that no one would believe her when she tried to explain what had really happened. I decided to write a different ending. I spent the first week building my case with the same precision I brought to my work as a financial analyst. I took screenshots of every message between Daniel and Madison, timestamped and verified. I requested my medical records from the hospital, documenting severe anaphylaxis caused by tree nut ingestion. I needed the ingredient label from the casserole dish, the physical proof that my mother had used pine nuts despite knowing they could kill me. I thought that evidence was gone, thrown away with the leftovers. But 3 days after the wedding, my father appeared at my door. He couldn't meet my eyes. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a plastic bag containing the empty casserole dish and the pesto jar with its ingredient label still attached. Pine nuts were listed clearly right there in black and white. Then he turned and walked away. It was the most he had ever done for me, and it was still not enough. I went to the county clerk's office and obtained a copy of the marriage certificate. The signature on the line marked bride said Haley Chapman, but it wasn't my handwriting. I have years of signed documents, tax returns, contracts, bank forms, all proving exactly how I write my name. The signature on that certificate was close, but not close enough. Madison had practiced, but she hadn't practiced enough. This wasn't he said, she said. This was documented fraud, and I had the evidence to prove it. My lawyer explained my options in clear, straightforward terms. The marriage was void from the beginning, what the law calls void ab initio. It never legally existed because Madison had fraudulently signed my name on a legal document. This wasn't an annulment where a valid marriage is dissolved. This was a declaration of nullity and official statement that Daniel and Madison were never husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Madison faced potential criminal charges: forgery in the second degree, a Class D felony carrying up to 7 years in prison, identity theft, criminal impersonation. The district attorney reviewed my evidence and expressed serious interest in prosecution. The allergy incident was more complicated. Proving intentional poisoning beyond reasonable doubt would be difficult. My mother could claim she forgot about the pine nuts, that it was negligence rather than malice. The text messages helped establish intent, but a defense attorney would argue they were ambiguous, that discussing pine nuts wasn't the same as planning to use them as a weapon. I thought about it carefully. I thought about spending years in courtrooms, reliving the worst night of my life over and over, watching my mother cry on the witness stand while her lawyer painted me as a vindictive daughter who misunderstood a tragic accident. I thought about the uncertain outcome, the possibility that after all that pain she might walk free anyway. I made a strategic choice. I cooperated fully with the forgery investigation, where the evidence was airtight and the outcome was certain. I declined to pursue criminal charges for the allergy. I chose my war, and I chose to win it. Madison's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to forgery in the third degree, a reduced charge in exchange for avoiding trial. The sentence was 3 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and a permanent felony record. That record would follow her forever. Every background check, every job application, every apartment rental for the rest of her life would show those words: convicted felon, forgery. She would never escape what she had done. The justice system made sure of that. I filed civil suits with the same methodical approach. Against Daniel, I sought recovery of the $28,000 I had contributed to wedding costs, plus $15,000 in documented financial support I had provided during our relationship, the apartment rent I had paid, the car insurance I had covered, the credit card bills I had helped with while he supposedly saved money for our future. Daniel, facing a fraud lawsuit he would certainly lose, chose to settle out of court for $35,000. It was nearly all his savings. I didn't feel guilty about that. He had helped plan my poisoning. He could live with the financial consequences. Against my parents, I didn't sue for damages. Instead, I made a formal demand regarding the $40,000 loan from Daniel's father. That loan was supposed to be forgiven once Daniel married Haley Chapman. But Daniel didn't marry Haley Chapman. He participated in a fraudulent ceremony with Madison Chapman, which meant the marriage was void, which meant the debt was never forgiven. Daniel's father, furious at being dragged into a scandal that was already spreading through his social circles, demanded immediate repayment. My parents, who had spent every penny of that money on a wedding that legally never happened, were forced to take out a second mortgage on their home just to satisfy the debt. The house they had lived in for 30 years was now collateral for their own betrayal. 4 months after the wedding, my grandmother hosted her 50th wedding anniversary celebration in Arizona. She hadn't been at the wedding. My mother had told her she was too ill to travel, that the flight would be too hard on her heart. The truth was simpler and uglier. My grandmother's flight had been canceled due to weather, and by the time she could rebook, the ceremony was over. My mother had been relieved. One less person who might notice that the bride looked different. At the anniversary dinner, surrounded by relatives who had seen the wedding photos on social media, someone congratulated me on my beautiful ceremony. My grandmother looked confused. "But Haley was in the hospital," she said. "Wasn't it Madison who walked down the aisle?" The table went silent. I didn't explain. I didn't narrate or justify or defend. I simply pulled out my phone and handed it to my grandmother. The photos, the medical records, the text messages, including the ones where my mother discussed handling the food, where Madison asked what would happen if I didn't get sick enough. My grandmother read for a long time. The room stayed silent. When she finally looked up, her face had turned to stone. She looked at her daughter, my mother, with an expression I had never seen before. Disgust, grief, the death of something that could never be resurrected. "You poisoned your own child," she said quietly. "You helped your other child commit a felony. You did this for money." My mother started crying. "Mom, it wasn't like that. We were desperate. The debt, the wedding, Madison's happiness. I'm changing my will tomorrow," my grandmother said, cutting her off. "The house in Arizona, the investments, everything goes to Haley. You've already shown you can't be trusted with anything I leave you." My grandmother's estate was worth approximately $600,000. In one sentence, my parents lost what they had been counting on as their retirement plan. They had gambled my life for $40,000, and it had cost them 15 times that much. Daniel and Madison tried to make their relationship work after everything fell apart. They had gotten what they wanted after all. They had each other. But relationships built on conspiracy rarely survive exposure. Daniel looked at Madison and saw a woman capable of poisoning her own sister. Madison looked at Daniel and saw a man who had let her take the felony charge while he settled quietly out of court. They argued about money since he was broke now. They argued about blame, each insisting the plan had been the other's idea. They argued about a future that neither of them could clearly see. 6 months after the void wedding, Daniel moved out. He had started seeing someone at work. Someone uncomplicated, he told Madison. Someone without a criminal record. Madison was alone. A convicted felon. Financially ruined. Estranged from her grandmother. Living in her parents' house, which now carried a second mortgage because of her choices. She had gotten the man she schemed for. She kept him for 6 months. They had calculated everything except me. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my sacrifice for stupidity, my love for blindness. For 35 years, they had built their understanding of who I was around the daughter, who always gave in, who always understood, who always put family first, no matter what it cost her. They never realized that every time I gave in, I was choosing to. And this time, I chose differently. 8 months after the wedding, that wasn't mine, I accepted a position as Vice President of Financial Operations at a firm in Portland, Oregon. It was a significant promotion, a recognition of skills I had spent years developing, while my family treated me like their personal emergency fund. More importantly, it was a fresh start in a city where no one knew me as the sister who got replaced, the bride who got poisoned, the woman whose twin stole her wedding. In Portland, I was just Haley Chapman, a professional who was very good at her job. I didn't tell my parents I was moving. I didn't owe them updates anymore. I packed my apartment in Boston without telling anyone in my family, loaded a moving truck, and drove across the country by myself. 3,000 miles of highway gave me time to think about who I wanted to be now that I was no longer performing the role they had assigned me. My new apartment was small, a one-bedroom with a view of the city skyline, but it was entirely mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't subsidizing anyone else's existence. The $850 a month I used to spend on my parents' health insurance now went into my retirement account. The money I used to send Madison for rent paid for a solo trip to Iceland, where I watched the northern lights from a hot spring and cried tears that had nothing to do with sadness. The savings I had set aside for a wedding that became a crime scene bought me furniture. I actually liked pieces I chose because I wanted them, not because they were on sale or practical, or what someone else thought I should have. I started volunteering on weekends with a nonprofit that supports adults from toxic family situations. I didn't share my story to be a cautionary tale or to get sympathy from strangers. I shared it so that other people might recognize the patterns earlier than I did. The slow erosion of boundaries that happens so gradually, you don't notice until you have none left. The financial entanglement disguised as family duty. The way love can be weaponized by people who know exactly how much you want to be loved. The reconciliation attempts came exactly as I knew they would. My mother sent a letter handwritten 12 pages long. I recognized her careful penmanship, the same handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards, and the ingredient label on a casserole designed to send me to the hospital. She explained, she justified, she reframed. We never meant for you to get so sick. We thought you'd understand eventually. Family forgives. That's what family does. I read the letter once, then put it through my paper shredder without responding. Madison texted me every few weeks, cycling through what I recognized as the stages of grief for a relationship she had murdered. Anger. You ruined my life. I hope you're happy. Bargaining. I'll do anything. Just talk to me. Give me a chance to explain. Depression. I have no one left. You're my only sister. Please. Denial. We could still be close if you'd just let this go. Sisters fight. It doesn't have to be forever. I blocked her number after the 6th message. I didn't do it out of hatred. I did it out of self-preservation. Daniel showed up at my Portland office 8 months after I moved, having found me through LinkedIn. He stood in the lobby holding flowers, looking older than he should have, asking the receptionist if he could speak to me for just a few minutes. Just coffee. Just closure. Just a chance to explain. I came down to the lobby, looked at him through the glass doors, and told building security that Daniel Mercer was not permitted on the premises and that they should call the police if he returned. Then I went back to my office and finished my quarterly report. He wasn't worth the disruption to my afternoon. These weren't acts of hatred or revenge. They were acts of hygiene. I wasn't punishing them by refusing contact. I was protecting myself by maintaining boundaries they had proven they would never respect. 11 months after the wedding, my grandmother died peacefully in her sleep at her home in Arizona. The funeral was held at a church she had attended for 20 years, and I knew my mother and Madison would be there. I went anyway. Grandma Ruth deserved to be mourned by someone who had actually loved her, someone who hadn't seen her as an inheritance to be secured. At the reception after the burial, Madison found me alone in the kitchen refilling my water glass. She looked thin, worn down, in a way that had nothing to do with grief over our grandmother. I have nothing left, she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Daniel's gone. Mom and Dad are drowning in debt. I can't get a decent job because of the felony record. Everyone knows what I did. I'm completely alone. I looked at my twin sister, the mirror image I had spent my whole life being compared to, and found wanting beside. The golden child, the easy daughter, the one who never caused trouble until she caused the worst trouble of all. You're alone because of choices you made, I said. Not choices I made for you. I was desperate. I loved him. You had everything, Haley. The career, the money, the future. I had nothing. I just wanted one thing for myself. So you took it. From me, your sister. She started crying. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I can't undo it. But you're my sister, my twin. We shared a womb. Doesn't that mean anything? I considered her question seriously. I had 11 months to think about it, to examine every angle to understand exactly what I felt and why. It used to mean everything to me, I said finally. I would have given you anything you asked for. A kidney, bone marrow, half my salary for the rest of my life. All you had to do was ask. Hope flickered in her eyes. Then, you didn't ask, you took, you conspired. You watched them put pine nuts in my food, and you moved my EpiPen so I couldn't save myself. That's not what sisters do, Madison. That's what enemies do. I made a mistake. You made a plan. You executed it. And when it failed, you wanted me to forgive you, so you wouldn't have to live with the consequences. That's not remorse. That's convenience. I picked up my purse. I hope you build a better life. I genuinely do. But I won't be in it. Not because I hate you, but because I've finally learned to protect myself from people who hurt me, even when they're family. Especially when they're family. I walked out of the kitchen. Madison didn't follow. 6 weeks later, I was cooking dinner in my Portland apartment. The recipe called for walnuts, which I can eat safely. I didn't double-check the ingredients 3 times. I didn't worry about hidden allergens. No one in this apartment was going to poison me. My phone buzzed. A text from James, a colleague from the nonprofit who had been asking me to dinner for the past month. He was patient and kind, and I had verified carefully that he had no hidden agendas, no complicated family debts, no twin sisters waiting in the shadows. Still on for Saturday, I found a restaurant with detailed allergen information for everything on the menu. Already confirmed they take it seriously. I smiled. Not because he was my happy ending, but because this was what consideration looked like. This was what safety felt like. Someone who accommodated my needs without resentment, without sighing, without making me feel like a burden for wanting to stay alive. I typed back, "Perfect, I'll be there." I stepped onto my balcony with a glass of wine. The Portland skyline glittered in the distance. The air was cool and clean and moved easily through my lungs. They had spent 35 years teaching me that love meant sacrifice, that family meant debt, that my value was measured by what I gave up. They were wrong. Love isn't sacrifice. Love is safety. Family isn't debt. Family is choice. And my value isn't measured by what I give up. It's measured by what I refuse to lose. Myself. I closed the balcony door and returned to my dinner, my apartment, my life. Not the sister who understood, not the daughter who forgave, just a woman who finally chose herself. Haley's story ends here, but the lessons it carries are ones that many of us need to hear. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are not strangers. They are the ones who sit at our dinner table, who know our vulnerabilities, who understand exactly where to strike, because they have watched us our entire lives. Family is supposed to mean safety, but for too many people, family is where they learn to accept mistreatment as love. If you recognized yourself in Haley's story, if you have been the one who always gives, while others only take, if you have been told that your worth is measured by how much you sacrifice, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to draw boundaries. You are allowed to protect yourself from people who have proven they will harm you even if those people share your blood. Saying no to abuse is not betrayal. Walking away from toxicity is not cruelty. Choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is survival. The hardest truth Haley learned was that love from family is not guaranteed simply because you give it. Some people will take everything you offer and still ask for more. Some people will see your kindness as weakness and your loyalty as opportunity. The only person who can decide when enough is you, and when you make that decision, you do not owe anyone an explanation. You do not owe anyone a second chance to hurt you. You owe yourself the life you deserve. Pay attention to the patterns. Notice who shows up when you need help and who only appears when they need something from you. Notice who celebrates your success and who tries to diminish it. Notice who respects your boundaries and who treats them as obstacles to overcome. These patterns will tell you everything you need to know about who truly loves you and who simply uses you. If this story touched you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own boundaries, your own worth, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from family to protect yourself? Have you ever been the one who gave too much for too long? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. If you are new to this channel, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss another story. We share stories like Haley's every week, stories about strength, survival, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you are worthy of love. That does not cost you your safety, your sanity, or your self-respect.